The Narcissist Hunting Grounds. The Therapist. Part 1. Hello, I'm HG Tudor. This is an ongoing series where I identify for you certain hunting grounds that appeal to narcissists. These are particular geographical places, but also fields, genres, professions, which attract narcissists because fundamentally they cater to the prime aims more effectively than other areas of life. Previously, I explained to you how the life coach is an area that attracts a lot of narcissists, and if you haven't watched that two-part series there, I'd encourage you to do so. Adjacent to the life coach, we have the therapist. Naturally, there are lots of very good therapists. That is obvious, but it also attracts a higher proportion than average of narcissists to this particular profession. There are many instances of people who have come across that narcissist therapist with devastating effects for them. Why is it that a therapist would be drawn as a narcissist to therapy as a means of dealing with other people? What is it about the occupation of therapist that attracts a disproportionate number of narcissists? There are a multiplicity of reasons as to why this happens. First of all, you're dealing with someone who in effect is giving you undivided attention. This probably could be seen as the holy grail for the narcissist. You have somebody that has come to you wanting help, which automatically demonstrates that they are giving control. They see you as the answer to their problems. They've come seeking your knowledge. They've come seeking answers from you. Thus, they are prostrating themselves at the altar of the narcissist by seeking therapeutic treatment. The individual pours out their heart, talks about childhood problems, ongoing relationship difficulties, issues at work, whatever it may be, and invariably, many of the things that are spoken about by the therapy patient are very personal, very emotional matters, which means that there's anger, there's tears, there's dismay, there's hatred, there's love. And all of this is directed towards the therapist because they're wanting the therapist's help. Thus, although the individual starts off as a non-intimate tertiary source, thus their fuel isn't particularly potent, after a session or two, they become a non-intimate secondary source, increasing the potency of that fuel. In the course of that 50-minute session, this individual will invariably fountain with fuel, crying about what has happened, pleading for assistance, beseeching the therapist for answers and understanding, all of which means a vast amount of proximate fuel flows towards that therapist. There's natural residual benefit. The therapist is being paid. Furthermore, it could aid them with regard to the presentation of a facade. Accordingly, the undivided attention of that therapeutic patient is very attractive to a narcissist who is a therapist. Secondly, many of these individuals are vulnerable people. They may be individuals who've experienced very difficult relationships and can't understand why it's gone wrong. It might be someone that's been grieving the loss of somebody, either a relationship or the fact that they've died. It might be someone that has particular personal problems that they want to resolve, that they want to figure out, an eating disorder, crippling social anxiety. They may struggle with their sexuality. They may engage in behaviours which aren't seen as generally normal in the sexual field and feel a degree of shame and embarrassment in relation to that. Highly personal information is shared, and the vulnerabilities that this person exposes is something which is very appealing to a narcissist. Firstly, the narcissist can use that vulnerability against the patient for the pursuit of the prime aims. Secondly, this individual's reliance on the therapist to help them goes to the point of control. And thirdly, it's an opportunity for the superiority of the therapist to loom large as they adopt godlike powers, for they hold the answers with regard to the problems of this individual. Thus, the fact that the narcissist therapist is exposed to a vulnerable person is hugely attractive to the needs and requirements of a narcissist. Thirdly, there is the time period. The involvement between a therapeutic patient and therapist is often elongated. There are some that might come for one session or two, but more usually they appear on a weekly, fortnightly, monthly basis that can go on for years. It's the case, therefore, that the various clients that therapists have become firm fixtures in the fuel matrix, reliable appliances that turn up every week, providing fuel, providing a residual benefit, completely under control. And therefore, they provide an excellent stable addition to the narcissist fuel matrix and remain in situ for years on end. The fourth reason is that the nature of the relationship is one where the narcissist therapist may well readily and easily take advantage of this therapeutic dynamic to move the relationship to one of intimacy. This naturally is a lack of boundary recognition and a transgression of the professional relationship. But the fact that many individuals who are the patient of a therapist understandably develop feelings towards their therapist based upon the fact that they've A, spent lots of time with them, B, opened up about very personal matters to them, and C, may well have been helped by them, and thus they're very grateful, results in this causing that individual to look very favourably upon their therapist and possibly even develop strong feelings for them. A non-narcissist therapist is far more likely to maintain the boundary and, notwithstanding potential overtures that might come from the patient, reject them based upon their professional integrity. But for a narcissist lacking boundary recognition and no emotional empathy, this further vulnerability of the patient is manna from heaven for the narcissist to move it into intimacy. Why might a narcissist therapist go down that route? Well, simply, it's the case that an intimate relationship means that control can be asserted all the more through the application of intimacy and sex. The fuel provision is improved. The intimate status of an appliance is superior to that of a non-intimate. Therefore, where a non-intimate secondary source therapy patient becomes an intimate partner secondary source, the fuel is more potent. Furthermore, there's a greater opportunity for larger amounts of fuel to be provided when intimacy occurs between the therapist and the patient. Furthermore, there's the residual benefit. Having sex with that patient feels good for the narcissist. The narcissist has nerve endings too. Accordingly, there is a motivation for the narcissist therapist to move it into intimacy to allow a greater assertion of control and with greater ease, to harvest larger amounts of fuel and to enjoy the residual benefits of forming the beast with two backs. Control, again, but in a different sphere, is also attractive to the narcissist because, in effect, the narcissist therapist could essentially impose never-ending treatment. They can suggest to this patient that so deep-seated are the problems it's going to take years of therapy to work through it, but they will help them and they will eventually enable them to achieve that goal. Furthermore, they may well future fake. You will be cured. I'll get you there. They will encourage them by saying you're making huge improvements, but there's still a way to go. And thus, the dynamic between therapist and patient is one whereby, in effect, the therapist, because they are the arbiter of the progress of that individual, and invariably that individual will place great stock and trust in the words of the therapist, obviating their own judgment as to whether they're making improvements, and rely on the feedback from the therapist, so that they can essentially be placed in never-ending treatment, which makes control all the easier. An individual in therapy is one who is apt for repeated manipulations, backhanded compliments, flattery, promised gain, threatened loss, future faking. And the nature of the dynamic between therapist and victim is such that those manipulations can be used, and can be used with ease in order to get to the prime aims. The therapy environment attracts narcissists because it's an excellent workout, if you like, a gymnasium for the narcissist, to hone and improve their cognitive empathy. Not all narcissists have cognitive empathy. As you know, in relation to my classification, lesser narcissists do not have it. And it's mainly mid-range narcissists that you will find in the position of being a therapist, that they operate with a facade, that they have a greater control over their ignited fury, and that they exercise cognitive therapy to varying degrees of effectiveness. Repeated exposure to troubled individuals who come to a therapist seeking help allows the narcissist therapist to flex their cognitive empathy and learn. By recognizing the forms of distress and upset, the circumstances in which that originates, and the expected response, this enables a narcissist who is a therapist to polish their cognitive empathy, to hone it, to make it all the more effective so that they fit in and they're better able to assert control and draw fuel from their victims. Therapy attracts narcissists because of the repeated prey. The patient becomes enmeshed. The therapist violates those boundaries by then engaging in contact outside of the therapy space. Once upon a time, they would just see this person every 2 weeks. Then it became every week. Then it became twice a week. The furtherance of the assertion of control by hoovering, they would then email that individual and encourage them to email the therapist for the purposes of seemingly supporting them. There would be phone calls outside of the therapeutic space, personal attendances also. All of this being done, of course, to cater to the prime aims. And that patient is made to feel special. They believe that their circumstances merit this increased attention from the therapist, that they are a novel and special case that needs this level of interaction. But what it actually does is serve the purpose of the narcissist with regard to the prime aims. And once again, the vulnerability of this individual and their susceptibility to such an approach makes therapy so appealing to narcissists. There is the opportunity for financial exploitation. Simply, this could be overcharging the client when they become suitably reliant upon the therapist, that the price is hiked, enabling the unscrupulous narcissist to earn more money, which is a residual benefit. It may well be the case that the narcissist looks to increase the number of sessions, which isn't necessarily required, but results in them receiving more money. In some instances, certain narcissist therapists might, after the transgression of boundaries, inveigle their way into the private life of the individual, causing them to transfer funds, writing them into being a beneficiary into their will. Thus, this residual benefit of financial exploitation upon a trusting and reliant patient appeals to the narcissist by entering therapy. It provides a fantastic opportunity for the narcissist therapist to insert themselves in the patient's lives. The purpose of therapy, of course, is for an individual to come with some issue, some problem, something that they wish to understand, and for them to explain that to the therapist, to enable that person to talk at length, to share their feelings and their thoughts, for the therapist to listen and offer insight and guidance, and in some instances, though not always, practical solutions to the problems that are being dealt with for the purposes of improvement. Some therapists are very passive, simply, how does that make you feel? Believing that the opportunity to talk about the issue enables the patient to find their own way to an answer, and in some instances that works. Others are more proactive, offering solutions and practical observations that may well assist the individual. But their role is receptive. It's meant to be a recipient of information and then providing a solution, in some instances, to the information that has been received. The narcissist therapist is more likely, as the patient becomes enmeshed, to give them personal information about the therapist, talking about themselves, talking about their experiences, oversharing information, which of course is self-indulgent of that narcissist and is done to control the individual, to draw fuel from them by way of response. This self-absorption, of course, is contrary to the interests of that therapeutic patient, because the narcissist therapist is making it all about them and not about their patient. In some instances, they may well talk about their own problems. For instance, if they're having difficulties with their spouse, they may well talk about it with their patient, eliciting a sympathetic reaction, which of course enables that narcissist therapist to achieve an indirect assertion of control over the problematic intimate partner primary source. And also, by virtue of the fact that the non-intimate secondary source has responded favourably and supportively to the therapist, has provided them with fuel and has demonstrated that the patient remains under control. In essence, the patient starts to provide therapy to the therapist, and this demonstrates a lack of boundary recognition and a way of insertion of that therapist into the world of the patient. An example of this comes from somebody who was in therapy, who explains, my former therapist, after 8 years, started becoming incredibly abusive. She started by taking our relationship to a more personal level, lack of boundary recognition. She offered me clothes of hers to borrow for events, kind gesture, assertion of control, that I said I had coming up. She gave me backhanded compliments when I tried anything on, things like, I knew that would look great on you, it's too big for me now since I lost so much weight, but I knew it would be perfect on you. But everything changed once I got engaged. She became controlling and possessive. I'd share my wedding planning details with her, and I never showed her one thing that she approved of or said anything nice about. She would make comments like, your dress neckline is too low. It looks like lingerie. I hope you're not wearing your hair like that. The bow at the base of your neck from the headband needs to be woven into your hair. You need to be wearing pearls. You're a bride. Don't worry, I have some you can borrow. They will be your something borrowed. She also attended my wedding in November, lack of boundary recognition, and her atrocious behaviour there is what made me know for sure I cannot go back to her ever again. My husband and I did a first look, so we saw each other before she even got there and took photos. When she found out he and I had already seen each other, she went crazy. That's not how it's done, you ruined it now, she shouted. This was our wedding and what we wanted. Fast forward to the reception, which was at a restaurant. She arrived and gave me a filthy look, use of the stare, because she was not seated at my table with my family and my husband's family. Sense of entitlement, reaction to wounding. Later, a song came on that was the song my husband and I danced to in the kitchen the first time we made dinner together. We didn't have a DJ. The fact that this song came on was totally random. When we heard it, my husband grabbed me and started dancing with me and singing it softly to me. And I was so overwhelmed with love and happiness I started crying. It was a really tender moment. Then comes my therapist, watching me like a hawk and seeing me crying, pushes in between me and grabs my face. "Breathe, breathe, it's okay," she says. "I'm here now, I am here," she said. Lack of boundary recognition, assertion of control, false compassion. I was livid. I just pulled away from her and kept saying I was fine. I didn't want to scream at my own reception and cause a scene. Before the ceremony started, my brother was waiting outside the room for everyone to leave. Our dad had died, and he wanted a moment alone with me before the ceremony. He was walking me down the aisle, and he wanted to give me something of my dad's to carry and just take a minute with his baby sister before she got married. My therapist went out and told him to go and leave me be and that I needed 5 minutes to myself. Haughtiness, lack of boundary recognition, sense of entitlement. I heard from several people that night that she went around and told them, "Look around, see this whole wedding? This is only happening because of me. I'm the reason she was able to even get married. If it weren't for me, she wouldn't have any of this." Sense of entitlement, self-absorption, broadcasting. I got married last year. I've not spoken to my former therapist since, and I've not been back to see her, and I won't. I don't know if she's in love with me or considers me her child, but I can tell you that 100% certainty that I never in a million years thought she'd act that way towards me. If I had any clue that she would, I would have stopped seeing her professionally long ago and would never have invited her to my wedding. An example whereby a grateful patient made the mistake of crossing a boundary themselves by inviting their therapist to their wedding, which clearly they thought that it would be a nice thing to do, and the therapist, if they recognised boundaries, would have declined. However, this clearly narcissist therapist didn't, and went on to criticise her choices and then attempt to interfere in various aspects of the wedding day itself. Another reason why narcissists are drawn to the arena of therapy is the ability to isolate the patient from external support. In effect, the narcissist doesn't want you to have access to any outside support or to those who might challenge their authority or their self-appointed guru-like status. Thus, the narcissist therapist will isolate you from your loved ones and anybody that threatens their control over you. They'll discourage you from consulting other perspectives, from getting a second opinion, or from getting support from anyone else but him or her. By cutting away potential influences over you, this then enables the narcissist therapist to wield complete and utter power over every facet of your life as you then become increasingly dependent upon them. The patient develops a sense of learned helplessness as they have nobody else there to validate them or support them or to provide guidance. In effect, the narcissist therapist becomes like a cult leader. They trap their victim in a bubble. They filter out any information that threatens to overtake, undermine, or compete with the narcissist therapist's views. The outsiders are viewed as dangerous. They're viewed as enemies. Accordingly, this means that if the individual in therapy has interactions with people on the outside, there's a greater chance that they will spot problems arising between the patient and their therapist. Thus, in order to maintain control over that individual, the therapist must smear the views of other people, reject them. In some instances, even fabricate the dangers that these outsiders potentially pose. Utilizing shame and guilt in relation to the patient, they explain how they shouldn't rely upon those individuals, how those individuals don't have their best interests at heart, how even those individuals could prove to be harmful to them, in some instances with fabricated allegations of abuse towards the therapeutic victim. Over time, the patient loses contact, possibly even going no contact with people who they don't need to go contact with at the behest and instruction of the narcissist therapist. The therapist occupies a very powerful position. The patient has become indoctrinated to rely upon their guidance, their instruction. They believe that they hold the answers to curing them, to helping them, to enabling them to gain insight. And invariably, a vulnerable individual who is very susceptible to the manipulations of a charismatic and power-wielding individual does what that therapist wants, so that the narcissist therapist ends up with complete control over them. An example of this is described where an individual explains how one of her brothers was married to a narcissist therapist. He and I were very close, and then she sent me a nasty letter, the therapist, full of projections. She had come to me with problems they were having, then went to him and lied, saying that I was bad-mouthing him. Ultimately, the therapist was threatened by how close me and my brother were. She alienated him from anyone who made her feel threatened. She lied and twisted things, playing the victim, making everyone responsible for keeping her happy. She's very beautiful and charming, but completely devoid of empathy, and extremely underhanded and manipulative. I understand they're divorced now, and he refers to her as vindictive. I hear she has a blog about therapy the right way, which is typical. She only knows one way to be and to do, and it's always the right way. She knows better than anybody else. The rest of us, mere mortals, can't seem to get it right without following what she says. Thus, the narcissist therapist looks to isolate in order to make it easier to control that particular individual. Another aspect is where the narcissist is able, as therapist, to inflict hurt on their patient, completely contradictory to what they ought to be doing. But the ability to isolate that individual, to have them to themselves, to make them wholly reliant on the narcissist therapist, the fact that they are in a position to understand the vulnerabilities of that individual means that the narcissist therapist has a golden opportunity to inflict hurt upon their patient. This might be done for the purposes of control and the drawing of negative fuel, and it may, in some instances, be representative of sadism on the part of that narcissist therapist, that there is a sadistic streak. Various individuals have spoken about the incidences of where narcissist therapists have caused harm to them. For instance, one woman explained, "I went to my narcissist therapist twice, and she shamed and yelled at me for crying. She was just like my narcissist mother. And I came to her when I was in the midst of a nervous breakdown. My husband called her to tell her that I wouldn't return, and she yelled at him and called him an enabler." Another victim explains, "I had a therapist tell me once that maybe I was reaping what I had sown, because perhaps I had done this to someone, i.e. emotionally abused them in a past life. He went on to say that if I could accept the abuse as the lesson I was put on earth to learn, then it would be so liberating for me." Another individual explained, "I had a horrid counsellor that sided with my oh-so-perfect perpetrator. When I was in tears about my cat's unexpected death, she said, 'Geez, it's just a cat,' siding and sympathising with my perpetrator on what a ridiculous person he had to deal with being married to me. I was devastated." Another person explained, "I had an emergency counselling session with a lovely lady, and she had scheduled a follow-up. When I went back, unbeknownst to me, she'd called in sick that day, and I was put in a little room with another woman that I didn't know. She proceeded to ask me all the same questions I had at my initial session, which upset me, because I had to rehash all of the trauma, and I had been happy to talk with the first woman who seemed to be a good fit. I mentioned my discomfort and confusion, and she completely ignored me, continuing to ask the same questions. Finally, after she was done, her assessment of me was The symptoms you have are very adolescent, like what I usually see in teenagers, so maybe you'd better address that. Needless to say, I was quite let down by the whole experience and didn't get the proper help for trauma for 3 to 4 years afterwards. I should also mention that the therapist only knew me for 30 minutes and spent no other time diagnosing or getting any more information, and then put me on the equivalent of what I would consider a horse tranquilizer amount of an older type of antidepressant, to the point I couldn't even stand up without feeling like I was going to pass out. Thus, examples there of the opportunity that presents itself to the narcissist to be unpleasant and hurtful towards that victim who has come seeking help. As mentioned, to assert control and draw negative fuel, and in some instances perhaps exhibiting sadism. Another aspect is to enable the narcissist therapist to blame shift, to make the victim believe that they are the one at fault. There are therapists who fabricate the idea that their patients are the ones that have provoked the abuse and that they have actually contributed to it, which essentially is a similar form of reasoning that the abuser utilizes to demean their victims. It's your fault. You made me do this. You brought it on yourself. The therapist depicts the victim as the abuser. They diagnose them as the deceiver. They basically act with a suspicious view about everything the victim says, cross-examining them, scrutinizing them, referring to what they reference as lies or half-truths. Thus, the victim becomes re-victimized, but this time by virtue of an abusive therapist narcissist. Some examples of that. One individual explained that she had 2 therapists who were narcissists. They lived in the same city and state where she lived with her now ex-financial abuser. They were aware of his physical abuse, psychological abuse, cheating, neglect of the child, and one of the therapists said that I had borderline personality disorder after only meeting her once, and I was falling apart as a consequence of the miscarriage that I had. She couldn't have cared less. She's a marriage and family therapist and a friend of my abuser, and she honestly should have her license revoked. The second therapist sent a written letter to the court for our hearing over my requested restraining order, stating that he, my abuser, was safe and responsible and that I was unstable and a liar. I'd only met this therapist twice. Both therapists believed his manipulation and lies. Another individual reports that she saw her therapist, who was a narcissist, for 2 years. Her children's dad had a court order at the time, and she and the father would gang up on her. The therapist believed everything that the narcissist ex-partner said to him, and in one session, the victim got up to walk out and the therapist was making a cuckoo sign around his head like, "She's nuts." This victim reported that she didn't use drugs, but the children's father had had a DUI. As soon as the court order was dropped, he stopped the therapy sessions. She never went back because she felt hurt and betrayed by the behaviour of the narcissist therapist. Another individual explained that she was a therapist herself, and a few years ago, when with her narcissist, he found a marriage therapist for the 2 of them. This therapist was a new therapist and totally untrained in spotting narcissistic or emotional abuse. He over-identified with my abuser, joined in on the gaslighting, and made me feel that I was losing my mind even more. When I pointed out the stonewalling, the isolation by my abuser from my friends, and lack of empathy, he turned it all around on me. He blamed me. He'd make comments like, "You'll understand this better if you ever do work with couples someday," and was repeatedly dismissing and one-upping my clinical expertise. I had 20 plus years of being an LCSW compared to his 3 years. I'm convinced that he made my situation much worse. I believe that he was also a narcissist. When I mentor and train therapists now, I make sure they know all about narcissists because it's the most common form of abuse I see, yet our clinical training barely covers it. An unsurprising revelation there from a therapist. Another individual explains, "I had one. She turned on me and wrote a letter for the court for my ex to gain custody. She lied in the letter. Fortunately, the court didn't accept it as evidence because she didn't come in person to be cross-examined. Another person explains that my narcissist mother's therapist wrote me a letter saying I'd regret having gone no contact once she passed away. I reported her to the state licensing board. A further individual explains, the therapist on base in the United States Air Force gave me a false diagnosis and actually praised my narcissist abuser. They screwed up trying to protect their active duty servicemen. My terrible position was made worse by this one officer especially. An officer on call came to help me when I went to the Unit Control Centre for Extreme Anxiety and Depression about 6 years ago. This was all from the narcissistic abuse cycle. I went in for the goal of getting some short-term help because I thought I was driving my husband crazy. The captain came in over an hour after being called to base. The entire time she sat there, she made conversation about her rank, her education, her having to make a trip to the base for me. I checked out of the conversation. She took notice and went on to punish me by taking out an abuse case against me, which stated I was the one who was abusing the narcissist. I had gone to her for help, and it was all used against me because this lady didn't want to do her job. This case risked my job, my home, and my life. I was already extremely depressed, and to go in and have everything thrown back in my face was excruciating. I did go off the hook, but my narcissist had to help by writing a statement to clear me. And we all did it, and we all know he did it to appear as the White Knight. Another person explained that her foster mum, who's a narcissist, is a hypnotherapist. She became part of her family when she was 5. The narcissist counsels people in her bed and breakfast style home. She's tried to treat me with hypnotherapy before, but I can't relax around her, nor is it ethical to treat your own child. She talked to my therapist growing up and had me falsely diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and claimed I had multiple personalities, so I wouldn't trust myself growing up. I'm now 32 and learning about myself all over again after I went no contact with my foster mother at 32. Another individual explains that when they went into the foster care system at the age of 17, they were assigned a counsellor. Her mother was also assigned a counsellor. Her stepfather, an abuser, was on his way out of the picture and certainly would not have gone to counselling. The victim was very well trained to be polite and agreeable, and in spite of life experience, wanted to believe that other people were not evil, malicious, or just manipulative. Thus, they had some rose-coloured glasses that they put on once in a while, when they didn't want to look too closely at a potentially bad situation. Looking back, she states that it was fascinating to those 2 counsellors. They pulled out all the stops. They began asking me more pointed questions about my mother and our relationship. I finally started opening up, giving details, talking about my mum, warts and all. Then I get to my next visit with my mum and she's furious. When we get in the car, she cut loose and said, "Your granddad is the best man on this planet. Why would you tell anyone that he abused me? He never abused anyone. You're a liar. I think you made up the story about your dad," the stepdad, and went on and on. I eventually asked her to take me back to the foster home. As it turns out, her counsellor was my counsellor's husband. I never said my granddad was abusive. They did. In one fell swoop, my narcissist counsellor derailed my court case against my abusive stepfather. He only got 6 months in jail, and that was only because he was stupid enough to get caught stalking me. My relationship with my mum deteriorated further as a consequence of this behaviour, leading her to sabotage me in court. And then, because the impropriety became a known thing, the state decided to release me from counselling, which I needed. Except I needed it from an ethical counsellor, not a narcissist. Instances whereby the behaviour of the narcissist therapist is one of blaming the victim and making life more difficult for them. Thus, a whole host of reasons supported by examples of those therapists, and of course it's not all, but those therapists who are narcissists and why they are drawn to the therapeutic environment, because it serves so many purposes for them. Have you had any experiences of a therapist that you believe is a narcissist? What were their behaviours? What did they do? How did they make matters worse? Share your observations in the comments section. I'm HG Tudor. Thank you for listening.